It was a packed committee hearing on a rainy Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. The room had the unmistakable scent of political tension, reporters perched in every corner, aides whispering updates into earpieces, and lawmakers shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Something was coming. You could feel it in the air. At the center of it all sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, his usual calm expression masking the sharp wit he was about to unleash. Across from him sat Dr. Elaine Buckman, a newly appointed federal official under the current administration, there to testify about a controversial federal education reform bill. The bill had been making headlines for weeks, by some as bold and progressive, but criticized by others as overreaching and deeply ideological. The hearing wasn't supposed to be contentious. Not on paper, at least. But then again, Kennedy wasn't known for playing by the script. Senator Kennedy leaned forward slightly. Microphone close, legal pad in hand. He began with a softball question one any official could answer. Dr. Buckman, could you briefly explain what the primary goal of this bill is? Dr. Buckman smiled, her tone confident. Yes, Senator. The bill seeks to align educational outcomes with social equity goals, ensuring that traditionally marginalized groups are uplifted through revised curriculum and community-based learning models. Kennedy didn't flinch. Okay, so you're saying the curriculum will be modified? Yes, to reflect a more inclusive and culturally aware educational environment. He scribbled something on his notepad and nodded slowly. Right, and who gets to decide what's inclusive or culturally aware? Dr. Buckman hesitated for just a moment. We have a panel of experts, historians, sociologists, appointed by whom? The Department of Education. And who leads that department again? Secretary Linda Hayes. Kennedy's eyes narrowed, but his tone stayed neutral. Is that the same Secretary Hayes who said last month that math tests are inherently discriminatory because they rely on Western modes of logic? The room stiffened. Dr. Buckman's smile faltered. That quote was taken out of context. Oh, I read the full speech, Kennedy replied, flipping a page in his notes. She said, quote, Western logic systems are a tool of the patriarchy. That sound about right? There was a pause. I believe the secretary was speaking philosophically. I believe she was speaking nonsense. Kennedy interrupted calmly. The room went still. A few reporters looked up. One even raised a brow. It was the first verbal punch of the morning, and Kennedy hadn't even stood up. Dr. Buckman tried to shift the topic. Senator, I think the larger point here is to reimagine how we educate now. Ma'am, the point is not to reimagine education until it becomes unrecognizable. The point is to teach kids how to think, not what to think. The tension ratcheted up. Everyone knew Kennedy was leading to something. He wasn't the type to spar endlessly. No, he always had a closer. A sentence that would linger long after the microphones were off. But he hadn't said it yet. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back for now, letting the weight of his words settle in the air like a storm cloud forming just over the Capitol dome. And the best part? No one, not even Dr. Buckman, realized they were walking straight into it. Because the sentence that would shut down the room wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a truth bomb, lined so sharp, so undeniably honest, that it would pierce through the fog of political jargon like a spotlight in the dark. But for now, Kennedy was just warming up. The pause after Kennedy's last remark wasn't just silence, it was anticipation. Even those who disagreed with him couldn't deny it. The man had a way with words. The kind of words that didn't yell or posture but cut like a scalpel. Clean and precise. Dr. Buckman shifted slightly in her seat, looking down at her notes before glancing back up. She was well prepared, or at least she thought she was. She'd briefed with the White House team the night before, reviewed policy lines, and even practiced mock hearings with advisors. But what no amount of prep could give her was the ability to predict John Kennedy. Senator, she said cautiously, it's important that we view education through a 21st century lens. It includes recognizing that certain narratives have historically been excluded from the curriculum. Kennedy nodded as if he agreed. Sure, I got no problem with history. In fact, I think we ought to teach more of it. The real kind. The messy kind. The kind that doesn't leave out the ugly parts. Buckman seemed encouraged. Exactly, that's what this bill aims to do. He leaned in again, eyes like a steel trap. Then why does the proposed curriculum framework recommend removing foundational texts like the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers from the core reading list? Boom, that was strike two. Dr. Buckman blinked, caught off guard. That's a mischaracterization. Those documents aren't being removed. They're being contextualized. Kennedy raised a brow. Contextualized. You mean kids will be taught that the people who wrote them were evil colonizers and that the Constitution is a document rooted in oppression? That's not what we're saying. That's what you're implying. And there it was. The beginning of Kennedy's trap. Because the hearing wasn't just about a bill. It was about a worldview. It's about a shift in how America sees itself. And Kennedy wasn't going to let that shift happen quietly. Tell me something, he continued. Do you think this country is inherently racist? Buckman hesitated. Think we have systemic issues that need to be addressed? It's not what I asked. I asked if you believe this country at its core is racist. I believe the systems in place have disproportionately harmed certain communities. He nodded slowly. So that's a yes. With extra syllables. The gallery stirred a chuckle or two. Not loud but noticeable, even some of the senators. To Kennedy's left looked slightly amused, though they tried to hide it. Buckman, trying to recover, said Senator, this is about equity, not ideology. No, ma'am, Kennedy replied. This is about whether we're going to teach kids to be proud of their country or ashamed of it. He wasn't raising his voice, didn't need to. The strength of his questions was in the delivery. Calm, steady, undeniably. Southern and brutally honest. Because if we start telling children that everything America ever did was evil, then don't be surprised when they grow up and want to. Burn the flag instead of salute it. Silence again. Dead silence. That line landed like a gavel. A reporter in the corner stopped typing. One of the aides next to a junior senator dropped his pen. The room wasn't just listening, now it was frozen. Kennedy leaned back, arms folded, watching Dr. Buckman squirm not out of malice but out of duty. The duty to push back against the tide he saw swelling beyond policy, beyond politics, into the very heart of the nation's identity. Everyone in the room could feel it. The sentence was coming. That one sentence. The one that would shut down everything. But it wasn't time yet. Not just yet. Kennedy was building to it. Brick by rhetorical brick, and the next exchange would be the turning point by now. Wasn't just a hearing, it was a slow-burning courtroom drama, and Senator John Kennedy was the unflinching prosecutor. The room had grown eerily quiet, as if everyone was afraid to interrupt the rhythm of Kennedy's words. Even Dr. Buckman seemed to sense that each sentence she uttered would either be flipped or filleted. Still, she pressed on, clinging to the talking points she'd rehearsed. Senator, she said with careful conviction, what we're trying to do is modernize the education system so that it serves every student, regardless of race, gender identity, or background. Kennedy nodded slowly. Got no problem with teaching all kids. Got a big problem when you start pushing politics disguised as progress. We're not pushing politics, she responded. We're expanding awareness. He tilted his head, then explained this. Why does your curriculum framework call for introducing second graders to gender theory? A flicker of discomfort passed over her face. That unit is designed to promote understanding and prevent bullying. Kennedy didn't even blink. Ma'am, I was raised in South Louisiana. I know what bullying looks like. It ain't fixed by confusing an 8-year-old about whether they're a boy or a girl. Buckman's composure wavered. This isn't about confusion, Senator. It's about inclusion. Inclusion, he repeated. That word's doing a lot of heavy lifting these days. And there it was again, the Kennedy effect. Taking abstract policy and dragging it into the realm of plain language, where the spin couldn't survive. Let me ask you this, he said, voice cool as a pond in November. If a parent doesn't agree with this curriculum, say they think it's too political or not age-appropriate, can they opt their child out? Buckman paused. In some cases, yes. And in other cases, it would depend on district policy. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. So what you're saying is, The government gets to decide what's best for other people's kids? That's not what I said. It's what you implied. And again, the room tenned. Everyone knew that this wasn't just about curriculum. Anymore, it was about control, about who gets to shape the minds of the next generation and who gets left out of that conversation entirely, Kennedy continued. When I was a boy, we were taught how to read, write, do math, and maybe learn a little civics. These days, it sounds like y'all want to swap algebra for activism. Dr. Buckman tried to respond, but he wasn't finished. I'm all for teaching kids the truth, said his southern drawl, now sharp with purpose. But when the truth becomes whatever makes someone feel better, that ain't education. That's indoctrination. That was the sentence that made a few gasps escape the back rows. Even the camera operators leaned in. This wasn't just a senator pushing back. This was a senator drawing a line in the sand, one that dared anyone in. The room to cross, you can decorate it with all the academic jargon you want. Kennedy added, but at the end of the day, if a curriculum tells a child they were born into privilege or oppression before they can even spell those words, then that curriculum has failed. The silence afterward was heavier than before. Dr. Buckman looked at her notes, clearly shaken. The usual rhythm of defense and deflection was gone. Kennedy wasn't just questioning policy, he was dismantling its foundation, one calmly delivered, sentence at a time. But everyone could sense something even bigger was coming. The sentence wasn't far away. The sentence, the one people would quote long after the hearing ended, but before it came. Kennedy would ask one final question, and it would be the spark that lit the whole room on fire, Senator. John Kennedy leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes locked on Dr. Buckman. The pause wasn't empty, it was intentional. Like a hunter waiting for just the right second to release the arrow. The tension in the chamber was suffocating now. Even the usual rustle of note-taking aides had stopped. No one wanted to miss what came next. Kennedy straightened up. His voice, still calm, rang out like a bell in a quiet church. Double quotes. Dr. Buckman, let me ask you something simple. She nodded cautiously. Oh, go ahead. If a sixth-grade student were to come home and ask their parents whether they were born racist, how? Do you think a mother should answer that? The room froze. For a moment, it wasn't politics anymore. It was personal, real, stripped of titles and theories and think tank jargon. Dr. Buckman opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Well, she began carefully. I think it depends. On the context of the conversation, no ma'am, Kennedy cut in softly. I didn't ask about context. I asked you what a mother should say to her child. There it was, the trap. Because any answer that agreed with the curriculum would be political suicide, and any answer that didn't would be a betrayal of her position. I believe the mother should encourage the child to examine privilege and understand the impact of systemic history, she stammered. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. So basically, tell him yes. No, Senator, she said quickly. I mean, the child should be taught to be aware. Kennedy leaned forward now, slowly, deliberately. Dr. Buckman, do you understand what happens to a child when you tell them they're guilty of something? They didn't do. Silence, he continued, voice like a scalpel. You crush their spirit, you poison their sense of self. And worse, you teach them to see the world through a lens of guilt instead of responsibility. The gallery was dead silent. A few senators shifted in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable, but no one interrupted, not yet. They couldn't. Because Kennedy had grabbed hold of the moment, and no one wanted to be the one to break it, Dr. Buckman. Looked like she was searching for a lifeboat in an empty ocean. We're not blaming children, Senator. We're educating them. He shook his head slowly. No, you're not. You're moralizing.
Oh.
You're turning classrooms into confession booths. A few muffled murmurs broke out in the back rows. Kennedy pressed on, his tone never rising, but his words landing with deadly precision. I've read the material. I've seen the lesson plans. Y'all say you want to promote equity, but what you're really doing is planting the idea that some kids are villains before they've even learned long division. He let that sit. No one moved. And let me tell you something, he added. You don't solve injustice by creating a new group to carry the burden. That line hit like a hammer. A senator 2 seats down lowered his head, clearly rethinking his stance. Dr. Buckman opened her folder as if to respond. But Kennedy wasn't done. The question isn't whether this country has made mistakes. The question is whether we're going to keep teaching kids to fix them or hate themselves for them. It was a direct shot, not at Dr. Buckman, not even at the bill, at the whole philosophy behind it. And still, he hadn't said the sentence that... one sentence. But now, the entire room was bracing for it, because it was coming. Everyone knew it. And when it landed, no one would walk away unchanged. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. John Kennedy didn't look angry. He didn't look smug. He just looked ready, like a man who knew the exact weight of every word he was about to say. Dr. Buckman had gone pale. She tried to recover, flipping through her notes, attempting to bring the conversation back to policy. But it was too late. She wasn't just defending a bill anymore. She was defending an idea, a sweeping new vision of education built not on shared knowledge, but shifting ideologies. And in front of her stood a man who saw through all of it, refused to blink. "Senator," she finally said, her voice almost pleading now, "the curriculum isn't about guilt. It's about awareness, about justice." Kennedy didn't respond right away. He stared at her, then at the stack of papers in front of him, and at the room, and then he said it. The sentence, the one that ended the entire debate. "Ma'am, if your justice needs children to feel ashamed of their skin before they can be proud of their country, then it ain't justice. It's propaganda." The room collapsed into silence, not stunned silence. Stunned would be too gentle. This was something else, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the hearing. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. One aide actually dropped his phone. Could hear the breath catch in someone's throat near the back of the room. Dr. Buckman froze. There was no response to that sentence. None that could survive daylight, because deep down, even those on the other side of the aisle knew what Kennedy said wasn't just clever. It was true, simple, unvarnished, razor-sharp truth. And truth, when delivered in just the right sentence, has the power to shut down everything: arguments, careers, entire ideologies, not through volume, not through anger, but through moral clarity. Kennedy didn't follow it up with a monologue. He didn't need to. He just leaned back, calm as a preacher after Sunday service, and folded his arms. He wasn't gloating. He was finished, and everyone knew it. The chairman looked up, unsure how to proceed. A few members tried to fumble their way into new lines of questioning, but their voices were brittle, paper-thin, like they knew the center of gravity, and the room had shifted and it wasn't coming back. Somewhere, near the exit, a journalist whispered, "That's the quote. That's going everywhere by tonight." And it did, within hours. The clip had gone viral. Kennedy's sentence was plastered across social media. News broadcasts, even editorial columns that didn't typically favor him, not because they agreed, but because they couldn't ignore it, was unforgettable, unespian. Unabled, unmatched, Dr. Buckman left the chamber quietly, her notes untouched. And while the bill might live on in some form, its moral high ground had just been reduced to rubble. Kennedy had done what few politicians ever managed to do. He'd ended an entire debate with one sentence, not by shouting, not by grandstanding, but by speaking a truth no one had the courage to say, and the silence that followed. That was the sound of a remand, a country realizing they'd just heard something that would echo for a very long time by the next morning. The sentence wasn't just echoing through Capitol Hill, it was everywhere. Cable news, talk radio, Twitter, TikTok, editorial pages that hadn't mentioned Kennedy in months were suddenly dissecting every syllable he'd said. In that sentence, "If your justice needs children to feel ashamed of their skin before they can be proud of their country, then it ain't justice. It's propaganda." It was already being printed on T-shirts. Fox News played the clip every hour. Their Chiron read, "Kennedy drops the gavel." Tucker Carlson called it the cleanest takedown of woke ideology since Reagan held office. Over at Newsmax, panelists replayed it 3 times in one segment and openly speculated whether Kennedy would consider a run for higher office. But it wasn't just conservative media. Even traditionally liberal outlets were forced to react. MSNBC called it provocative, calculated, and undeniably effective. CNN ran a panel debate with legal experts and educators, trying to determine how such a brief moment had created such a national firestorm. The New York Times ran a headline: "Kennedy's sentence splits the education world in two," because that's exactly what had happened. Educators across the country were suddenly being asked where they stood not on the bill, but on that sentence. School boards were flooded with emails from parents demanding clarity. Was their child being taught to love their country or to apologize for it? Social media lit up. Memes, threads, video duets of people reacting to the clip. Even Gen Z. Influencers who didn't normally post about politics started weighing in. One high school student with 2 million followers posted, "I don't agree with everything Kennedy says, but that sentence hit different." It did, because it wasn't the kind of line you could dismiss. You had to deal with it. It forced people to confront something bigger than a policy dispute. It tapped into a national identity crisis that had been quietly bubbling beneath the surface for years. What should we be teaching kids? History or guilt, pride or penance? The sentence had cracked open a debate far larger than the committee hearing ever intended. A debate that spilled out of classrooms and newsrooms and onto the dinner tables of millions of Americans. Meanwhile, the White House found itself in an awkward position. Press Secretary Cara Delmont was grilled repeatedly during the daily briefing. Does the president believe American children should be taught that they're privileged or guilty? Based on their race? A reporter asked. She dodged the question once, twice, but the press wouldn't let it go, because Kennedy's sentence had drawn a bright red line, and now everyone had to declare which side they were on. Even members of the president's own party were split. A few progressive senators rushed to defend Dr. Buckman's approach, accusing Kennedy of oversimplifying a complex issue. But others weren't so quick to condemn. One Democrat, speaking off the record, told a reporter, he said, "What a lot of us are afraid to admit, that we've gone too far, too fast." And that was the power of the moment. Kennedy hadn't just shut down a witness. He'd cracked open a conversation. No one wanted to have Onda. No one could escape from anymore. The sentence wasn't just surviving the news cycle. It was redefining it, and for the first time in years, a single line from a Senate hearing had become something rarer than outrage, a cultural turning point. Behind the scenes in Washington, panic was setting in. What had started as a routine education hearing had become a full-blown political wildfire. And all it took was one sentence from Senator John Kennedy, a sentence that didn't just resonate with the public, but rattled the very foundations of the policy elite. In party strategy rooms, the mood was frantic. Communications directors scrambled to rewrite talking points. Senate aides dug through archives to find anything and anything that could reframe the narrative. But it was too late. The public had already picked a side, and most of them were siding with Kennedy. He hadn't just embarrassed a witness. He'd made the entire agenda behind the education bill look out of touch, toned, even dangerous, and worse. He made it look intentional. Poll numbers began shifting within days. A Gallup flash poll showed that 72% of Americans agreed with Kennedy's statement. Even independents, typically harder to pin down, overwhelmingly supported it. But the real surprise came from younger voters. Gen Z and millennials, often seen as progressive-leaning, weren't buying the messaging from the administration this time. They weren't against teaching about history or equity. They were against being told who they were before they had a chance to decide for themselves, and Kennedy had set it out. Loud, the education lobby, furious and caught off guard, began launching counter-messaging campaigns. Paid ads, press conferences, public statements by university professors, all aimed at reframing Kennedy's words as manipulative, simplistic, or dog whistle politics. But none of it stuck. Why? Because no academic could out-talk common sense. No white paper could erase the memory of a single sentence that millions of people heard and felt. Meanwhile, Kennedy said nothing more. He didn't have to. He didn't tweet. He didn't hold a press conference. Just returned to work like it was any other week. That's what made it worse for his opponents. They couldn't bait him. They couldn't spin him into a fight. He was just calm, like a man who'd lit a match and then walked away, knowing the fire would spread without him lifting another finger. Inside the West Wing, the president's advisors were split. Some wanted a direct rebuttal. Others argued that engaging would only legitimize Kennedy's point. Ignore it, one senior aide said. It'll blow over. But it wasn't blowing over. Across the country, school board meetings were filling up with parents quoting Kennedy verbatim. Local news channels were covering districts in Texas, Florida, Ohio, and even parts of California where parents demanded curriculum transparency. One mother in rural Michigan stood at a podium, held up a printout of Kennedy's sentence, and said, "This isn't about right or left. This is about right and wrong." Even Hollywood started reacting. One prominent actor posted on Instagram, "I'm not conservative, but I'm a parent. And I agree with Kennedy on this one." For the establishment was a nightmare. Because this wasn't just a culture war moment, it was a credibility collapse. The experts, the bureaucrats, the media class, all had insisted that the curriculum changes were normal, necessary, harmless. But Kennedy had exposed the rot with one line, and now people were asking the questions they were never supposed to ask. What else are we not being told? What else is being pushed under the banner of equity? And just like that, the power shifted. Kennedy wasn't just a senator anymore. He was the voice of the rebellion. 3 days after the hearing, the Senate chamber buzzed with an energy rarely felt in those marble halls. Senator John Kennedy entered as he always did, quietly, with a file tucked under his arm and a fountain pen clipped to his coat pocket. But this time, something was different. Senators from both sides of the aisle looked up when he walked in, and then something happened that no one could have predicted. A few stood up, then a few more. No clapping, no chanting. Just a silent, respectful gesture from Senator Sam, his political allies. Others, longtime critics who were acknowledging what everyone now knew. Kennedy hadn't just made a point. He had changed the conversation. It was the kind of moment that doesn't get written into press releases, but gets remembered in memoirs. The rare occasion in politics when someone says the exact thing the country was thinking before the country even realized it was thinking it. Because Kennedy's sentence didn't just stir debate, it woke people up. In the days following the hearing, Kennedy had received over 80,000 letters and emails from teachers, parents, and even students. One letter came from a high school civics teacher in Oregon, a lifelong Democrat, who wrote, "I've taught for 27 years. I've never seen such a clear, principled stand from any lawmaker, let alone one from the opposite party." Another came from a 14-year-old in Pennsylvania. "Senator Kennedy, I used to hate history, but you made me want to learn it again." But not everyone was clapping. The backlash was fierce. Progressive media outlets painted Kennedy as a manipulator, using fear to score political points. A New York Magazine op-ed accused him of weaponizing parental anxiety. Activist groups accused him of punching down on marginalized voices. And still, he didn't respond. No press tour. No victory lap. Just silence. Because Kennedy understood something the rest of the city didn't. He knew the power of letting the truth speak for itself. But not all reactions were hostile. In fact, some of the most surprising came from the other side of the aisle. Senator Martha Graves, a centrist Democrat from Wisconsin, stood up in a press conference and said, "I don't agree with Senator Kennedy on many issues, but I agree with him on this. We must never let our children carry the sins of their ancestors on their backs." That clip went viral. Kennedy didn't call her afterward. He didn't need to. They'd never shared so much as a lunch before, but in that moment, they shared something else. Moral clarity, even house. Democrats began peeling off quietly from the bill Dr. Buckman had testified in support of. By the end of the week, a dozen of them had either called for revisions or withdrawn support entirely. It wasn't because of political pressure. It was because they couldn't defend it anymore. Not after that sentence in the Senate cafeteria. Aides whispered about how Kennedy had changed the tone of the entire education debate. Some even joked that he had done more damage to the administration's curriculum initiative in 6 minutes than any coordinated campaign had managed in 6 months. But Kennedy? He just ordered his usual black coffee and a side of grits, because, to him, it was never about applause. It wasn't about going viral. It was about telling the truth in a room full of people who had forgotten how to hear it. And when the Senate reconvened that day, even his opponents sat up straighter, because they knew Kennedy wasn't done yet. And the country? Well, the country had just remembered what it felt like to hear a leader say exactly what needed to be said once, and that once was enough. If there's one thing Washington can't resist, it's building someone up just to try and tear them down, and after Senator John Kennedy's sentence set the nation on fire. The political machine kicked into overdrive to put the flames out, to burn him down with them. By Monday morning, every major left-leaning outlet had launched a coordinated media blitz. Editorials sprang up overnight with headlines like Kennedy's dangerous simplicity, the sentence that set progress back 50 years, how one senator undermined education. With one clever soundbite, it didn't stop there. Academics were paraded onto news panels to label his comments as anti-intellectual. Cable anchors accused him of distorting the intentions of progress. Influencers posted threads attacking his character, his voting record, even his Southern accent, mocking it as a symbol of ignorance rather than charm. But Kennedy remained silent. No rebuttals, no late-night interviews, no Twitter spats. Because he didn't need to play defense. He knew what his critics didn't. Truth defends itself. Still, the pressure was mounting. The personal attacks were escalating. One viral clip on social media labeled him a racist in a nice suit. Protesters gathered outside his Louisiana office. A segment on a satirical comedy show painted him as a relic of the past, complete with a cartoon version of Kennedy being outwitted by a woke raccoon. But just when it seemed like the tide was turning against him, someone no one expected stood up in his defense. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The same Representative Crockett who had sparred publicly with Kennedy on other issues. The same firebrand progressive who once called him a charming menace to progress. That Jasmine Crockett. She stepped in front of cameras during a press scrum and did something that shocked everyone. She defended him. "I don't agree with Kennedy on most things," she said. "But this cancel him over sentence nonsense? It's weak. He said something that a lot of people are feeling. Maybe you don't like how he said it, but you can't pretend the man doesn't believe it." The reporters swarmed. "Are you siding with him on education?" one asked. "No," she replied. "I'm siding with honesty. I've been in too many hearings where people say a whole lot of nothing. Kennedy said something, and people heard it. You want to beat that? Use better ideas, not smear campaigns." That clip went mega viral. Over 10 million views in under 24 hours. And suddenly, the narrative flipped again, because Crockett's defense did more than surprise people. It gave Kennedy's critics a choice: keep attacking and risk looking like bullies, or back off and rethink their strategy. Most backed off. Not because they suddenly agreed with Kennedy, but because Crockett had drawn another line. You don't have to agree with someone to respect the courage it takes to say what others won't. Kennedy never commented on her remarks. No thank you tweet, no public gesture. But behind the scenes, something shifted. His allies grew bolder. Moderate Democrats grew quieter in the press. They started asking different questions, not about whether Kennedy's sentence was too harsh, but about why it had resonated so powerfully. What was happening wasn't just political, it was cultural. A moment when two voices from opposite ends of the spectrum, Kennedy and Kroc, agreed on something rare: truth matters more than tribes. And in a city built on sides that shook the walls, weeks passed, the hearings continued. The news cycle moved on. Headlines shifted to new controversies. And Washington returned to its usual rhythm of noise and nuance. But one thing didn't fade: that sentence. If your justice needs children to feel ashamed of their skin before they can be proud of their country, then it ain't justice, it's propaganda. It had left a mark not just on a committee room, but on the entire American conscience. It began showing up in the most unlikely places. A school district in rural Ohio, facing pressure to overhaul its curriculum, voted unanimously to revise its materials not to erase history, but to emphasize unity over guilt. Their press release quoted Kennedy word for word, a charter. School in Texas used it as the theme for its end-of-year parent meeting, and then came something no one could have. Predicted a national teaching award ceremony held in Chicago featured a keynote speaker who opened her remarks by saying, "In a time where educators are being told what to feel, not just what to teach, Senator Kennedy reminded us all what real education looks like, telling the truth without telling kids who to be." She wasn't from Kennedy's state, she wasn't from his party, but she was part of the shift. The moment had grown beyond politics. It had become principle. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, Kennedy returned to his regular work committee meetings, small-town visits, listening sessions with farmers and teachers. If he noticed the change in how people spoke to him, he didn't let on, but they noticed. They came up to him not with policy questions, but thank yous. One man said what I couldn't find the words to say. Another, "I didn't know how to talk to my daughter about what she was being taught. Now I do." And perhaps the most powerful came from a former teacher in Alabama who mailed a handwritten note. "You saved a part of this country's soul." With that sentence, he reminded us we're allowed to love our nation and be honest about it. In Washington, the ripples continued. The bill Dr. Buckman testified for, it was quietly shelved. It's never formally killed, just left untouched, buried, under the weight of a single moment that exposed too much to survive scrutiny. And Kennedy, he never once claimed credit. When asked about the line by a reporter weeks later, he simply replied, "I wasn't trying to win anything. I was just tired of seeing kids turned into ideological battlegrounds. No victory speech, no lap around the media circuit. Just a reminder of what leadership used to look like and, in rare moments, still can. Because that's the truth about moments like these. They're rare. They're real. And when they happen, they cut through all the clutter. They remind us that politics isn't supposed to be theater. It's supposed to be about truth, about principles, about standing up when it's easier to sit down and speaking, plainly when the room expects spin." Senator Kennedy didn't shut down the room with noise. He did it with clarity. And in doing so, he gave the nation something it didn't even know it was missing, a sentence that made people think, a sentence that made people listen, a sentence that, in the end, wasn't just about policy. It was about us.